right, let's dive right into this deep dive. This time, we're all about becoming better listeners in English, which I know is something you've been wanting to really level up.
Yeah, it's a super important skill, isn't it?
Totally. And we've got this great transcript from the Echo English podcast, so much good stuff packed in there, why listening is so important, practical stuff we can use, and they even talk to an expert.
Oh, cool. I always like hearing what the pros have to say.
Do too. And get this, there's even a listening challenge built right into the episode, so get ready to test your skills along the way.
I'm up for the challenge.
So they kick things off by saying listening is like the foundation of communication.
Yeah, that makes sense, right?
Think about how we all learned language as kids. We were all ears first.
Totally. Like sponges, just soaking it all up.
Exactly. I remember my niece, oh my gosh, she would just repeat everything she heard. So cute, but also like a little bit annoying sometimes.
I bet.
But it totally works. She picked up language so fast.
And that's what the podcast is getting at, right? It all starts with listening.
Right. They actually asked this question, have you ever felt lost in a conversation because you couldn't keep up?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think a lot of English learners have probably felt that way at some point.
Yeah, totally. You want to participate, but it's like your brain is just trying to process everything.
Exactly. And that's where good listening techniques come in, which is what we're going to, unpack today.
Yeah, for sure. And they get into some awesome ones. The first one is active listening, which sounds kind of basic, but it's more than just, having your ears open.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
It's about like really focusing on the sounds, the tone, the rhythm. They even say you can repeat phrases out loud to help solidify them.
Ooh, I like that.
I've actually noticed that when I'm really into a song, I tend to repeat the lyrics without even thinking about it.
That's probably your brain doing some of that active listening in the background.
Maybe. Yeah. So it's like we can train our ears without even realizing it sometimes.
Exactly. And they talk about a really cool technique called shadowing, which takes this to a whole other level.
Okay, shadowing. I'm intrigued. Tell me more about that.
Basically, you listen to a native English speaker, could be anything, a podcast, video, whatever, and then you immediately try to mimic what they just said.
Oh, so you're like their shadow copying everything they do.
Yes. You're not just repeating the words, you're also trying to copy their intonation, rhythm, everything.
So it's about really embodying how they're speaking.
Exactly. And the cool thing is, it works on a bunch of skills at the same time.
Really? Like what?
You're working on pronunciation, obviously, because you're trying to match those sounds, but you're also building fluency because you have to keep up with the pace.
Okay, yeah, I see that.
And you're even boosting comprehension because you have to actually process the meaning to be able to repeat it accurately.
Whoa, that's pretty amazing. So it's like a 3-in-1 language workout.
Exactly. Now, another technique they talk about is using subtitles, but in a strategic way. I know this can be a bit controversial because some people are like, never use subtitles, but, they have a good point.
Oh, yeah, I love subtitles, especially for movies. But how do they suggest using them strategically?
They suggest kind of a step-by-step approach. You could start with subtitles in your native language just to get the general idea of what's going on.
Okay, makes sense.
Then switch to English subtitles. So now you're connecting the written word with the spoken word.
Oh, I see, like a bridge between the two.
And then the ultimate goal eventually is to try watching without subtitles at all.
That's the dream, right?
Exactly. It's like a gradual process of building up your confidence and your skills.
Totally. And then another thing you mentioned is listening to different accents. I've definitely noticed how that can be a challenge.
It's like cross-training for your ears.
Ooh, I like that analogy.
Like if you only ever run on a treadmill, you might be in for a surprise when you try to run on a trail.
Yeah, for sure. It's way more challenging.
It's the same with listening. If you only ever listen to one accent, you might be totally thrown off when you encounter a different one.
Yeah, I remember the first time I went to Scotland. It was like everyone was speaking a different language.
Right. So by exposing yourself to different accents, American, British, Australian, all of them, you're basically prepping your ears for the real world.
That's so true. The real world is full of accents.
Exactly. Now, they also talk about this technique called chunking, which I think is super helpful.
Chunking. Okay, break it down for me.
Think of it like looking at a map. You don't need to memorize every single street name to get where you're going, right?
Right. You just need the main landmarks and the general direction.
Exactly. It's the same with listening. You don't need to understand every single word to get the gist of what's being said.
So you're saying it's more about focusing on the big picture.
Exactly. That can be such a relief for learners who feel overwhelmed trying to catch every single word.
It's like permission to not be perfect, right?
Exactly. And they give some tips on how to actually do this chunking thing, which we can get into later.
Awesome. But first, let's talk about authentic content, because that's where I get excited.
Me too.
It's all about using real-world stuff, like podcasts, TED Talks, audiobooks, movies.
It makes learning so much more enjoyable, right?
Exactly. Not just boring textbook dialogues.
Yeah, and with authentic content, you're learning without even realizing it because you're actually engaged with the material.
Totally. I've honestly learned so much vocabulary just from binge-watching my favorite shows.
There you go. See? It works. They also talk about taking notes, which might seem a bit old school, but it can really make a difference.
So I shouldn't feel bad about pausing the podcast every 5 seconds to write something down.
Not at all. Think of it like you're creating a treasure map to vocabulary expansion. Jot down those new words or phrases that catch your attention, and then later on you can look them up, explore their nuances.
It's like building your own personal dictionary of cool words and phrases.
Exactly. And they even suggest using those notes to practice other skills, like writing or speaking. So it's a really versatile tool.
Okay, this is all great stuff. We've covered a lot of practical techniques for better listening.
Yeah, we've got a good toolkit going so far.
But I'm also curious about the why of listening. Like, why is it so important beyond just understanding what people are saying?
That's where the interview with their guest expert comes in. They're kind of a language learning guru.
Oh, cool. What did the guru have to say?
Well, one thing they emphasize is that listening helps you pick up on the nuances of real conversations, the kind of stuff you don't always get from textbooks.
Like how people actually use idioms and slang.
Exactly. Or the subtle ways they use intonation to convey different meanings.
So it's about going beyond the literal words, like reading between the lines.
Right. They also talk about how listening can help you develop a more intuitive sense of grammar. Like just knowing what sounds right, even if you can't explain the rules.
Yeah, I get that. Because you just know it feels right.
Exactly. And that's something that a lot of learners struggle with because they're so focused on trying to translate everything in their heads.
Oh, I do that all the time. It's exhausting.
It is. And the guest expert really stresses the importance of immersion, surrounding yourself with English in fun and engaging ways. They suggest things like switching your phone settings to English, listening to music in English.
So basically making English a part of your everyday life, not just something you study.
Exactly. The more you immerse yourself, the more your brain starts to adapt to thinking in English.
So you're not constantly stuck in that translation mode.
Right. You start to think and react more naturally in English.
I love that. Okay, before we move on, what were those resources the expert recommended?
Oh, yeah. They mentioned some great apps, BBC Learning English, ESL Pod, and Fluent. And they said to try listening to a variety of different content like news podcasts, interviews, stories.
It's like a whole toolkit for language learning.
Right. And the key is to find stuff you actually enjoy so it doesn't feel like a chore.
That's so important.
Speaking of fun stuff, the Echo English podcast actually includes a listening challenge.
Ooh, a challenge. I like it. What's it about?
We won't play the audio here, but I encourage you to go back and listen to the original episode. They play a short clip, and then they ask you some questions to see how well you understood it.
Okay, I'm definitely going to check that out. Any tips for tackling the challenge?
Remember all those techniques we talked about? Active listening, focusing on key phrases, chunking.
Got it.
And pay attention to the speaker's intonation. It can give you a lot of clues about their meaning.
Okay, I'm feeling ready to take on this challenge. I think after this deep dive, I'm going to be a much better listener in English.
I think so too.
And before we move on to the next part, I'm curious. What's one small thing you could change in your daily life to, surround yourself with more English? Maybe listen to an English song on your commute, or watch a short video clip without subtitles.
That's a great question, and we'll get into more specific strategies and resources in the next part. But for now, just think about one small step you can take today.
Love it.
Make English a more integrated part of your life.
I'm all about that.
Starting today.
Perfect.
It just occurred to me as we were talking about all this immersion stuff, the Echo English podcast, they made this point about listening, that it's not just about, understanding the words. It's like tuning into the music of the language.
Ooh, I like that. The music of the language. What do you mean by that?
Think about it. Like intonation, rhythm, pauses, all that stuff. It all contributes to the meaning. And it affects how we feel when we hear someone speak.
Yeah, it's like the difference between reading sheet music and hearing it played, by a live orchestra.
Exactly. The notes are the same, but the experience is totally different. And when you start paying attention to those musical elements of English, your comprehension just goes way up.
It's like you unlock a whole other level of understanding.
Exactly. You start picking up on these subtle cues that maybe you were missing before.
So it's not just what they're saying, it's how they're saying it. Like the tone of voice, the emphasis.
Yeah, the emphasis, the pauses, even the silences can be meaningful.
Oh, totally. It's like, imagine someone saying, "I'm fine." But depending on their tone, it could mean a million different things.
Right, exactly. It could be genuine, or it could be masking, like frustration, sarcasm.
Exactly. It reminds me of how important body language is, like in a face-to-face conversation. You can tell so much from someone's expressions, even if you don't understand every single word they're saying.
It's like body language for the voice. And, the podcast actually suggests this technique called focused listening, which is all about tuning into those musical elements.
Okay, focused listening. I like it. What's the trick?
So imagine you're listening to like an interview. Instead of trying to grasp everything at once, you could decide, okay, this time I'm just going to focus on the interviewer's intonation. Like notice how their voice goes up and down, where they pause for emphasis, things like that.
So it's like choosing what to zoom in on with a camera.
Yeah, exactly. It trains your ear to be more sensitive to like the subtle ways that English is spoken.
Okay, I like that. I could try that with like movies or even just people watching in a cafe or something.
Yeah, totally. Become a voice detective. Start noticing things you didn't even realize were there before.
Okay, so we've talked about the music of the language, focused listening. What else is there?
Well, another key idea they highlight is that listening isn't just about understanding individual words. It's about making connections, like building meaning from the context.
Right, it's like a jigsaw puzzle.
Yeah.
The individual pieces only make sense when you see the whole picture.
Exactly. They talk about a technique called predictive listening, which is basically using those context clues and what you already know to kind of anticipate what the speaker might say next.
So it's almost like your brain is filling in the blanks.
Exactly. Like if you hear someone say, "I went to the store, but I forgot to buy," you can probably guess they're about to say something like milk or bread.
Right.
Or,
Knowing me, probably chocolate.
ah!
But yeah, I get it. You're using your own knowledge to actively engage with what you're hearing.
Exactly. And that active engagement is key to better comprehension.
So how do you actually practice predictive listening?
Well, they suggest a few things. First, pay attention to the speaker's main message. Like, what's the big picture? What are they trying to get across?
Okay, so get the main idea first. Got it.
Then focus on key words and phrases. Those are like the signposts pointing you towards the meaning. And don't be afraid to make educated guesses, even if you miss a few words here and there.
Yeah, it's better to guess and be wrong than to just be totally lost.
Exactly. You can often figure out the gist even if you don't understand every single word. And if you're really unsure, just ask for clarification.
Okay, that makes sense. But, one thing I personally struggle with is remembering what I've listened to. It's like it all just goes in one ear and out the other.
Yeah, I know what you mean. It's easy to get overwhelmed with information overload these days.
Totally.
Well, the Echo English podcast, they talk about the importance of active recall to help with that.
Active recall. Okay, so it's not enough to just listen. You have to actually do something with the information afterward.
Yeah, exactly. One technique is summarizing what you listen to, either out loud or even in writing. It forces you to think about what you heard and put it into your own words.
So like create my own mini version of the podcast episode.
Yeah, exactly. It makes you really think critically about, like, what were the key points? What was the main message?
I like that. What else?
Another technique is, like, try teaching the material to someone else.
Even if that someone is just your cat.
Even if it's your cat or even an imaginary audience. The act of explaining it out loud helps solidify it in your own mind.
It's like you have to understand it well enough to teach it.
Exactly. And it forces you to find ways to make the information clear and engaging. And then they also recommend good old-fashioned flashcards.
Flashcards, really? Those still work.
They're classic for a reason. They're great for active recall.
Yeah.
Write a key word, a phrase on one side, the definition, or maybe a related image on the other side, and then quiz yourself.
Yeah, that's a good way to, drill the information into your brain.
And you can get creative with flashcards. Use colors, drawings, even record yourself saying the words.
Ooh, that's a good idea. Record yourself. Make it more interactive.
Make it fun and memorable.
Yeah, that's important. Speaking of fun, I don't know about you, but I tend to get distracted really easily when I'm trying to listen in English.
Oh, yeah, totally. Our brains are like wired to look for novelty and stimulation, so it's a constant battle.
It is. Any tips for dealing with that?
Well, the podcast suggests creating a distraction-free environment as much as possible. Turn off the TV, put away your phone, maybe find a quiet spot in the library or somewhere where you can really focus.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like, treat it like an important appointment.
Exactly. Even if it's just for 15 minutes, setting aside that specific time tells your brain, okay, it's time to focus now.
And I'm a big fan of breaking things down into smaller chunks. Like, trying to listen for an hour straight can be overwhelming.
Totally. It's like trying to run a marathon without any training. Start with 10 or 15 minutes and then gradually increase as you get better. And be kind to yourself if you get distracted. It happens to everyone.
Yeah, we're all human.
Just gently bring your attention back to the material. Or maybe take a quick break if you need to, like a little walk, some stretches, whatever helps you reset.
Yeah, a little break can do wonders.
The key is to be consistent with your practice, even if it's just a little bit each day, like watering a plant. That consistency helps it grow.
I love that analogy. So we've talked about a lot of techniques, how to make listening a habit, the why of listening, what's next. So we've talked about all these ways to get better at listening, in a kind of controlled environment. But real-life conversations, those can be like a whole different beast.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Background noise, people interrupting. Sometimes it's like everyone's talking at once.
Yeah.
How do you even deal with that?
It's definitely not like sitting in your quiet room with your headphones on, but the good news is the Echo English podcast, they actually give some advice for handling those messy real-world situations.
Okay, good, because I need all the help I can get, especially in noisy places. It's like my brain just shuts down.
Sensory overload, I get it.
Yeah.
Well, they start off by acknowledging that, real-life conversations are rarely as, neat and tidy as the dialogues you hear in textbooks, so you got to be ready to, adapt your strategies on the fly.
So flexibility is key. What kind of things do they suggest?
One tip is to really pay attention to the speaker's body language and facial expressions.
Oh, okay.
Those nonverbal cues, those can give you a lot of extra information, to help you fill in the gaps if you miss some words.
It's like becoming a detective of nonverbal communication.
Exactly. And they also say don't be shy about asking for clarification. If you didn't catch something, just politely ask the person to repeat or to rephrase.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It shows you're actively listening, and most people are happy to help.
I think sometimes we get so caught up in trying to sound perfect that we forget it's okay to, to ask for help.
Totally. It's way better to ask than to pretend you understood and then miss the point completely. Now, one real-world situation that I know a lot of English learners find tough is watching movies or TV shows.
Oh, tell me about it. Especially without subtitles.
I know, right? Subtitles are great, but the podcast, they actually encourage learners to see this as a challenge to embrace.
Okay.
You don't need perfect comprehension right away. It's about gradually building up your stamina over time.
Like training for a marathon. You don't start by running 26 miles on day one.
Exactly. They have some tips specifically for movie watching. First, start with movies or shows that you're already familiar with.
Okay.
That way you have a general idea of the plot and character, so it's easier to follow along with the dialogue.
Yeah, it's like rewatching a favorite movie, but this time you're really focusing on the listening.
Right. And if you get lost, you can always rewind or use subtitles strategically, but really try to pay attention to the actor's intonation and expressions they convey so much.
It's like a whole other layer of language to unlock.
It is. Now, another thing that can be tricky is listening to people from different cultural backgrounds.
Right.
All those different accents and dialects.
Sometimes it honestly feels like they're speaking a completely different language.
I know it can be overwhelming. But the podcasting reminds us that, this diversity is actually a beautiful thing.
Yeah, it is.
It's a chance to really expand your listening horizons and appreciate how rich and varied the English language is.
It's like the world is this giant mixing bowl of English accents.
Exactly. So instead of getting frustrated, try to see it as an opportunity to grow.
I like that. Any tips for dealing with those situations?
Well, they say focus on the speaker's key words and phrases. Those are usually the most important for understanding the main message.
Okay, even if I don't catch every single word.
Right. And be patient, be understanding. It takes time to adjust to different ways of speaking.
Makes sense.
It's like learning a new dance at first that feels awkward, but then with practice, you get the rhythm.
Nailed it.
And if you're really struggling, don't hesitate to politely ask for clarification. Most people are happy to help.
And hey, you might even learn some cool new slang or expressions along the way.
Exactly. So I think one of the big takeaways from this deep dive is that listening, it's not passive. It's an active skill. It takes effort. It takes practice, just like any other aspect of language learning.
You really have to work at it, just like you would with grammar or vocabulary.
And the Echo English podcast, they emphasize that it's a journey, not a destination.
I like that.
You're always learning. You're always improving.
And thankfully, there are so many fun ways to practice. Movies, podcasts, conversations with friends. It's about finding what works for you and making it a regular part of your life.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to make mistakes.
Oh, for sure. Mistakes are part of the process.
That's how we learn. Embrace the challenge, stay curious, and most importantly, have fun with it.
Absolutely. Well said. I think this has been a really eye-opening deep dive. We've covered so much ground, from the why of listening to all these practical techniques to how to make it a habit, even how to handle real-world challenges.
It's been a good one.
I feel like I've learned so much.
Me too. So, before we go, one final question for you to think about. What's one small action you can take today to make listening a more integral part of your English learning journey?
Yeah, maybe set a reminder to listen to a podcast for 15 minutes. Or challenge yourself to watch a 5-minute video clip without subtitles.
Those are great ideas. Even small steps can lead to big progress over time.
Totally.
So keep practicing, keep exploring, and keep those ears open to the wonderful world of English.
Awesome. Until next time.